The most dangerous person in your life isn't the enemy you see coming. It's the stranger you invited in, handed your keys to, and trusted with your children. My mother thought she was hiring a miracle. She didn't realize she was actually opening the door to a ghost who had been hunting her for 30 years. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked with a heavy, rhythmic thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It was 1:10 a.m. Most of the neighborhood was draped in the silent, suburban fog of Ohio, but inside our house, the air was electric with desperation. My mother, Sarah, was sitting at the oak dining table, her hands trembling as she clutched a lukewarm mug of coffee. Between her high-pressure career and the crushing weight of postnatal exhaustion, she was drowning. She needed help. She needed a savior. Then there was a knock. 3 soft, precise raps on the glass. When Mom opened the door, Elena was standing there. She didn't look like a typical nanny. She was dressed in a charcoal gray pea coat, her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful. But it was her face that stopped my mother's breath. Elena didn't just look qualified, she looked familiar. There was a symmetry in her features, a specific tilt to her chin that mirrored my mother's own reflection in the hallway mirror. "I'm sorry for the hour," Elena whispered, her voice a low, melodic hum. "I saw your ad, I felt drawn to it. I think I'm exactly what you're looking for." The interview lasted 3 hours. It wasn't just that Elena had glowing references, it was that she was uncanny. Without being asked, she reached into the cupboard and pulled out the exact brand of Earl Grey tea my mother drank. She knew which floorboard creaked near the nursery. She even knew the nickname my mother used for the baby, a name we had never put in the job posting. "You're a lifesaver," Mom breathed, blinded by her own need for sleep. But as Elena went to hang her coat in the mudroom, she left her leather tote bag slightly unzipped on the bench. Curiosity, or perhaps a sudden chill of intuition, made me glance inside. There was no resume. There were no diapers. Instead, tucked into a side pocket, was a series of small, clear plastic jewelry bags. Inside each one were clumps of blonde hair, meticulously coiled, and used tissues, all labeled with dates spanning the last 6 months. My heart hammered against my ribs. These weren't Elena's items. They were my mother's. Elena hadn't just arrived tonight. She had been harvesting my mother's life from the shadows long before the interview ever began. The first week with Elena felt like waking up from a decade-long fever. My mother, Sarah, was finally sleeping, her face losing that gray, haunted tint of exhaustion. Elena was a ghost in the hallways, silent, efficient, and devastatingly perfect. She didn't just manage the house, she anticipated my mother's every move before she even made it. But the relief was a thin veil, and underneath it, something old and cold was beginning to stir. It started on a Tuesday at exactly 3:00 a.m. I was standing in the shadows of the upstairs landing when I heard it, a low, melodic hum drifting from the nursery. It wasn't a standard nursery rhyme. It was a melody with a strange, jagged rhythm, a song that felt like it belonged to a different century. I watched through the cracked door as Elena rocked the cradle. She wasn't looking at the baby. She was staring at a framed photo of my mother on the dresser, her lips moving in a perfect, synchronized mimicry of the song. Downstairs, I found my mother standing in the kitchen, paralyzed. Her face was ashen, her hand frozen halfway to a glass of water. "That song," Mom whispered, her voice cracking. "My mother wrote that. She sang it to me in the dark when I was 3 years old. She never wrote it down. She died before I could even ask her for the lyrics." Mom bolted up the stairs, flinging the nursery door open. "Elena, where did you hear that? That's a family song, it's private." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even turn around. She kept rocking the cradle, her voice steady and calm. I found an old music box in the attic, Sarah. It must have belonged to your mother. I just picked it up. It's a beautiful melody, isn't it? My mother's eyes darted around the room. There was no music box. We had cleared that attic months ago when we moved in. It was empty. But as Mom backed out of the room, gaslighting herself into believing her own exhaustion was playing tricks on her, I saw Elena's hand slip something into her pocket. Later that night, I crept into the study and pulled out a dusty box of family heirlooms. I found a Polaroid from my mother's 5th birthday party, a sunny afternoon in a park in 1988. My mother is front and center, blowing out candles. But in the far, blurry background, partially hidden behind a weeping willow tree, stands a young girl. She is wearing the exact same dress as my mother. She has the exact same hair. And she is staring at the camera with a look of pure, unadulterated hunger. If you're starting to see the pattern, hit that subscribe button right now. We're about to uncover a secret that was buried 30 years ago. The tension in the house was no longer a whisper. It was a physical weight, a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up every time Elena entered a room. My mother was unraveling. She started checking the locks 3 times a night, convinced she was hearing footsteps that didn't belong to her. But the mind plays tricks when you're sleep-deprived. The body, however, doesn't lie. It happened on a humid Thursday afternoon. Elena was in the kitchen, expertly deboning a chicken for dinner, a task she performed with a surgical, unsettling precision. As she reached for a high cupboard, her sleeve caught on the corner of a spice rack, pulling back the fabric of her left forearm. I froze. My mother, who was sitting at the island scrolling through her phone, looked up at the exact same moment. There, etched into the pale skin of Elena's inner wrist, was a jagged, silver, crescent-shaped scar. It wasn't just a mark, it was a map. My mother dropped her phone. The screen shattered against the tile, but she didn't even blink. Slowly, with a hand that shook violently, Sarah pulled back her own left sleeve. There it was, a mirror image. A perfect, crescent-shaped birthmark that my mother had been told her whole life was a surgical scar from a respiratory procedure she'd had as an infant. The 2 marks were identical, down to the slight puckering of the skin at the base. "Where did you get that, Elena?" Mom's voice was a ghost of itself, thin and terrified. Elena didn't pull her sleeve down. She stepped closer, the kitchen knife still glinting in her right hand. She held her wrist up next to my mother's, the 2 scars almost touching. "The fire, Sarah. Don't you remember the smoke? Don't you remember the screaming?" I don't know what you're talking about," Mom stammered, backing away until she hit the refrigerator. That night, after Elena retreated to her room, Sarah called her estranged Aunt Martha, the only living relative who had been present during Sarah's birth. The call lasted only 4 minutes. I watched through the cracked door as my mother collapsed onto the floor, the phone sliding from her hand. Aunt Martha had confessed. "There were 2 of you, Sarah, but the house was burning and the debt was drowning us. We could only afford to save 1 life. We chose you. We thought the other was gone." By the following Monday, the woman living in our house wasn't just a nanny anymore. She was a parasite, and she was finishing the meal. The mimicry had become aggressive. Elena had stopped wearing her charcoal coats and tight buns. Instead, she was wearing my mother's favorite silk blouses. She had started using Sarah's expensive Chanel perfume, the scent cloying and heavy in the hallways. But it was the voice that was the most terrifying. If I closed my eyes, I couldn't tell who was speaking. Elena had captured every inflection, every nervous laugh, and every sharp intake of breath that belonged to my mother. The psychological takeover was nearly complete. One evening, I walked into the master bedroom to find Elena sitting at the vanity, sliding Sarah's diamond wedding ring onto her own finger. She turned to me, her eyes cold and triumphant. "Doesn't it look better on me?" she asked, her voice an exact, haunting replica of Sarah's. When my father came home from a business trip that evening, he didn't even realize anything was wrong. Elena met him at the door, handed him a drink, and whispered a joke that only he and Sarah shared. He laughed, kissing her on the cheek, while my real mother sat paralyzed in the darkened living room, drugged into a stupor by the herbal tea Elena had been preparing for her all week. Sarah tried to scream, tried to stand up and reclaim her life, but her limbs felt like lead. She watched from the shadows as Elena sat in her chair, ate her dinner, and hushed her baby. "I'm firing you," Sarah finally managed to slur when Elena came to check on her. "Get out of my house." Elena leaned down, her face inches from Sarah's. She didn't look angry, she looked pitying. "I've already redirected the mail, Sarah. I've changed the recovery emails on the bank accounts. The neighbors think you're having a mental breakdown. If you call the police, who do you think they'll believe? The woman screaming in the dark or the one holding the baby?" She leaned closer, whispering the words that shattered the last of my mother's resolve. "I'm not the nanny anymore, sister. You are." The basement was the only place left where the air didn't smell like Sarah's perfume. It was cold, damp, and smelled of old concrete, a graveyard for the things our family wanted to forget. I found my mother there, huddled against the water heater, her eyes bloodshot and her voice a jagged whisper. She had finally snapped out of the medicinal fog Elena had trapped her in, fueled by a primal maternal rage. But she wasn't alone. Elena was standing in the center of the room, illuminated by a single, flickering bulb. She wasn't wearing the silk blouse anymore. She was holding a stack of yellowed, crumbling envelopes, the paycheck she had been working for her entire life. "You think I'm here for your husband, your house." Elena's laugh was a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the foundation. "I spent 20 years in the foster system, Sarah. I moved through 12 different homes, each one colder than the last. I was the baby bee who didn't exist. I was the girl they sold to pay for your heart surgery." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to the crescent scar on her wrist, the mark of the fire that had supposedly saved her. "They didn't just choose you," Elena hissed, stepping into the light. Her face was a mask of grief. "They traded me. They took a black market payout from an adoption ring to ensure you had the best doctors, the best schools, the best life. Every birthday cake you ate, every vacation you took, that was bought with my disappearance." Elena threw the envelopes at my mother's feet. They weren't letters, they were legal filings. Elena hadn't been spending her nanny's salary on clothes. She had been paying a high-end forensic firm to reconstruct her stolen identity. She had the DNA results. She had the original, unredacted birth certificates. She had enough evidence to prove that Sarah was legally a ghost, and Elena was the rightful heir to everything our family owned. "I didn't come here to kill you, Sarah," Elena whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "I came to collect my half of the life you stole, but looking at you now, I realize I don't want your half. I want the whole thing." The sound of a distant, wailing siren cut through the basement walls. The neighbors had finally called the police, not for Sarah, but for the intruder Elena had reported earlier that evening. Elena reached into the waistband of her jeans and pulled out a small, black handgun. She didn't point it at Sarah. She held it out, grip first, toward her sister. The police are at the door, Elena said, her eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. Either finish what our parents started and erase me forever, or step aside and let me be the woman I was born to be. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers strobed against the basement windows, turning the concrete walls into a rhythmic, pulsing nightmare. This was the fracture point, the moment 30 years of stolen history finally collided. Sarah stared at the cold steel of the handgun Elena held out to her. Her finger hovered over the trigger guard, her reflection staring back at her from a face that was no longer her own. "Do it," Elena whispered, her voice devoid of fear. "End the lie, be the only one again." But Sarah didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she let the heavy metal clatter onto the floor. She realized that killing Elena wouldn't save her life. It would only finish the job their parents started. Sarah reached out and took her sister's hand, pressing their identical scars together. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't filled with malice, but with a crushing, shared grief. "I won't erase you again," Sarah sobbed. When the officers burst through the door, they froze. They saw two women, identical in height, hair, and bone structure, huddled together on the floor. One was dressed in Sarah's silk blouse, the other in a tattered sweater. Both were weeping. The confusion was immediate and total. "Which one of you is Sarah?" the lead officer demanded, his hand on his holster. Elena looked at Sarah. A silent communication passed between them, a dark, secret pact forged in the basement. Elena stood up first, smoothing back her hair with a chillingly familiar gesture. She spoke with Sarah's exact lilt, her exact confidence. "I'm Sarah, this woman. She's my nanny. She's had a complete psychological break. Please take her gently." Sarah didn't protest. She watched, paralyzed, as the police led her sister, the real Sarah, away in handcuffs. Elena had won. She had successfully swapped their lives, stepping into the role of wife and mother, while the woman who actually birthed the child was escorted to a psychiatric ward. 6 months later, the nanny was released from a private facility. She moved to a small town 3 states away, living under a name she found on a redacted birth certificate, Mary Alice. The story ends in a sun-drenched park. A woman sits on a bench, watching a toddler play in the grass. A stranger walks by, smiling at the beautiful scene. "Your daughter has your eyes, Sarah," the stranger remarks. The woman on the bench smiles back, a smile that is too sharp, too triumphant. "Thank you," she says. But as she turns to pick up the child, she catches her reflection in a puddle. She pauses, her hand trembling. She realizes she can't remember if she is the sister who stayed or the sister who returned. The swap was so perfect, the mimicry so deep, that the original has been lost forever. The question remains, when you spend your whole life pretending to be someone else, is there anything left of the person you used to be? Thank you for walking through this dark history with us. If you think Sarah is the one in the park, comment original. If you think Elena finally got her life, comment swap. Don't forget to subscribe. Our next story reveals what was really found in that Ohio attic.